Yesterday, a detective made a shocking phone call that shattered everything Emily thought she knew about her husband. The man she mourned, the man she buried, might not be dead after all. But what really happened to Robert Calloway? Why would a husband fake his own death, stage a deadly accident, and disappear without a trace? What secret life was he hiding? And who was the mysterious woman he ran away with? And the biggest question of all, who was the person that suddenly spotted Robert Calloway alive in another city, walking side by side with his mistress? Tonight, the truth finally comes out. The lies, the betrayal, the twisted plan behind the fake accident, everything will be revealed. If you think you know how this story ends, think again. Before we uncover the shocking conclusion, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Now, let's find out what really happened to Robert Calloway. The search of the lake took 4 days and found nothing, which was the expected result because there was nothing to find. The Nashville police handled the case initially as a possible drowning, and then, as the absence of a body persisted past the point at which recovery would typically have occurred, and as the investigation developed a clearer picture of the household's financial situation, began to consider alternative explanations. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Sandra Pruitt who had worked missing persons and financial crimes cases for 11 years and who was, by the specific training and experience she brought to the case, somewhat more prepared than average to recognize the pattern she was looking at when the financial investigation began to produce its results. The credit accounts surfaced in the first week, the 9 accounts, the 4 in Margaret's name, the debt total that Margaret had not known existed. Margaret received this information in a conversation with Detective Pruitt that she later described as the worst hour of her professional life because she was a nurse, and she had spent 20 years delivering difficult information to people, and she understood in the receiving of this information exactly how much of the preceding 5 years of her life had been managed rather than shared. She sat in the conversation with the stillness of someone processing something that is too large to process in the time available, and then she said, with the specific quiet of a person whose clarity has arrived ahead of her emotion, that she did not think Robert was in the lake. Detective Pruitt agreed with Margaret's assessment and had been building toward it independently. The staging at the lake was too specific. The wallet, the phone, the open door, the note, the combination of props that together communicated distress, but that individually communicated design. People who intend to drown themselves do not typically compose a set of visual signals that would read clearly to a first responder as a drowning scene. People who intend to disappear and need the disappearance to be read as a drowning do. Pruitt pulled Robert's financial records and found the transfer pattern, the small, regular movements of money out of the joint accounts and into accounts she could not immediately identify, and referred the financial investigation to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, which had the resources and the legal reach to trace the money through the layers of the banking system that the small transfer amounts had been designed to pass through unnoticed. The FBI assigned a special agent named Thomas Wade to the financial investigation, and Wade spent 3 weeks following the money with the systematic patience of someone who understood that money leaves traces that are difficult to erase completely, and that the traces, assembled in the right sequence, produce a map. The map, when it was complete enough to be legible, pointed to a bank in Phoenix, Arizona, and an account in the name of David Marsh, and an address associated with that account that the Phoenix field office confirmed was an occupied residential property. The FBI and the Phoenix Police Department coordinated the approach to the address on May 28, 2017, 55 days after Robert Calloway's truck was found at the lake. They arrived at the house at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday in the particular way that federal arrests are made, deliberately, with sufficient personnel to manage the range of possible responses and with the legal documentation that transforms the moment from an intrusion into a procedure. Robert Calloway answered the door in a gray t-shirt and was confronted with the specific experience of being found by people who had been looking for him with full knowledge of what they were looking for and who expressed no surprise at what they found. He said nothing initially, which was the response of someone whose options have narrowed to the point where silence is the only one that does not immediately make things worse. Cheryl Dawson was in the house. She was in the kitchen when the agents came through the door, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the agents and at Robert and understood, in the specific and total way of someone whose understanding arrives faster than they want it to, that the man standing in the hallway was not David Marsh. The agents separated them immediately. Cheryl was interviewed for 2 hours. She told the agents everything she knew, which was extensive in detail and incorrect in almost every foundational particular, because everything she knew was what Robert had told her, and almost none of what Robert had told her was true. Robert Calloway was arrested on May 28, 2017, and charged with wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, and insurance fraud. The last charge arising from a life insurance policy on Robert that Margaret had held for 14 years and that had a face value of $400,000, a policy whose terms Robert had been aware of and whose potential payout to Margaret he had understood. In the design of the disappearance, would be claimed by Margaret after the standard waiting period if no body was found and the death was eventually presumed. He had not calculated precisely on the insurance. It was not the primary financial mechanism of the plan, which was the Phoenix account and Cheryl's resources, but he had understood it as a secondary element that would have added to Margaret's recovery in a way that might. He had perhaps reasoned balance against the harm done by the credit accounts. This reasoning, to the extent it existed in a coherent form, was not a defense and was not offered as one. It was simply one more element of the case that the prosecution presented to the jury when the trial began in Nashville in January 2018. The prosecution's case was organized around the financial evidence, the 9 credit accounts, the 14 months of small transfers, the Phoenix account, the identity documentation, the stage scene at the lake, and was built with the methodical precision that financial crime prosecutions require when the narrative is complex and the jury needs to follow a chain of transactions rather than a single dramatic event. The lead prosecutor was a woman named Catherine Hollins who had been trying federal financial crimes cases for 16 years and who had the specific quality of clarity in complex case presentation that juries respond to. She could take a 14-month sequence of financial transactions and make it legible to 12 people who had no particular financial training by returning repeatedly to the same central question, which was not how but why, and not why in the abstract, but why in the specific, personal, human sense of what Robert Calloway had decided that Margaret Calloway's life was worth to him. Margaret Calloway testified for 1 day. She had spent the 8 months between Robert's arrest and the trial managing the financial consequences of what he had done, working with a bankruptcy attorney to address the credit accounts, selling the Nashville house to pay the most significant debts, moving into a smaller apartment in a part of the city she had not lived in since her 20s, continuing to work her shifts in the cardiac care unit because the work was both financially necessary and, in the way that necessary work sometimes is, stabilizing. She testified with the composed directness of someone who had processed the anger and the grief and the specific humiliation of 20 years of marriage to someone who had been managing her view of their shared life, and who had arrived at the point where the testimony was simply an account of what had happened that needed to be given accurately and completely, and that she intended to give exactly that way. She described the marriage, the finances, the financial explanations, the morning the detective called the hospital, the lake. She described the discovery of the credit accounts. She said, at one point in the cross-examination by Robert's defense attorney, that she had trusted him because she had 20 years of evidence that trusting him produced the results she expected, and that she had not known until the investigation that the evidence had been managed to produce those results. The defense attorney said that the evidence she had cited was the evidence she had been given. Margaret said yes. She said that was exactly correct. The jury heard the precision of that exchange and what it contained and carried it into deliberations. If you are loving this story, go ahead and like this video and subscribe for more. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They found Robert Calloway guilty on all counts. The verdict was returned on a Thursday afternoon, and Robert Calloway received it with the expression of someone who had understood the probable outcome and had spent the preceding months preparing himself for it, which was a form of preparation that, unlike his preparation of the lake scene, produced no advantage. He was sentenced in March 2018 to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $287,000, the total of the debt in Margaret's name and both names combined, as established by the financial forensics. Cheryl Dawson was not charged with any crime arising from the investigation. The investigation was thorough and produced no evidence that she had any knowledge of Robert's actual identity or the sources of the money he had access to and had used in the establishment of their shared life in Phoenix. She had invested her divorce settlement on his advice, the $40,000 in the real estate fund, and an additional $60,000 over the following 2 years in vehicles he recommended, and the combined return on those investments, when they were liquidated as part of the asset freeze following his arrest, was approximately what she had invested, because the investments had been legitimate enough in their structure even if the advice that drove them was motivated by his interest in demonstrating competence rather than hers in building wealth. She was left, after the asset liquidation and the mortgage she was carrying alone, with approximately $70,000 of her original $180,000 divorce settlement. She gave a statement to investigators that was comprehensive and accurate and that demonstrated, to the agents who received it, that she had been deceived with the same sustained deliberateness that Margaret had been deceived with, adapted to the specific version of herself that Robert had constructed for her consumption. Agent Wade noted in his case file that Cheryl Dawson was, in his professional assessment, the most straightforwardly victimized party in the case, someone who had trusted a person who was professionally constructed to receive that trust and who had not had the history or the institutional context that Margaret had that might have produced earlier alarm. Margaret Calloway moved to Knoxville in 2019, 2 years after the arrest, to be closer to her sister, who had been the primary person in her life through the post-arrest period and who had provided the specific and practical support that the specific and practical crisis required. She continued nursing and took a position at a hospital in Knoxville that she has described as the best professional environment she has worked in, which is an assessment that her colleagues there confirm is mutual. There are people right now in financial situations that someone in their household is managing on their behalf and presenting to them as something other than what it is. The specific method changes. The specific amounts change. The specific destination of the exit changes. What does not change is the mechanism, the management of another person's view of a shared reality, sustained over time, with the patient attention of someone who has decided that the other person's trust is a resource rather than a relationship. Margaret Calloway trusted Robert for 20 years because 20 years of evidence told her that trusting him was reasonable, and because the evidence had been managed to tell her exactly that. The evidence that was not managed, the transfers, the accounts, the Phoenix address, the partial fingerprint that always exists somewhere in a construction this deliberate, that evidence told a different story. It always does. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the construction always has a seam. Subscribe. Hit the bell. And I will see you.